understanding the need that ERP implementations have a real technology component to them, and that customers were coming to us not only looking for best practices in terms of how to get MRP running, but also in terms of how to set up and install an application successfully, how to deploy it successfully. And as the cloud has continued to grow, we found ourselves moving into the area of cloud deployment as it relates to ERP. And that's really become kind of an area for us that's become especially intriguing. Now, myself, I've been with the Estes Group now for 8 years. And I've kind of lived through that transformation internally, coming from the customer field in the ERP community and working into now more the bigger concern towards the managed services and the cloud deployment aspect of the business.
Great. Yeah, it's a great area to be in. That definitely is where the industry and the needle is moving, is much more toward the cloud than on premise recently.
So it really is. I think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish your thought. I didn't want to interrupt you there.
I was just finding that the need for that idea of going beyond our existing parameters, our existing network boundaries, has really been a subject that customers are coming to us to understand more and more, as their own IT staff seems to be less and less interested in maintaining those old boxes.
Yeah, and it's an opportunity for organizations to outsource the whole IT support function and getting out of the business of software development and software maintenance and all that good stuff, and letting the experts take care of that while they run their businesses.
Right.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, I guess to start, maybe just to set some context, maybe help us understand, what the cloud is, because I think, conceptually, I think a lot of us understand just generally the cloud is offsite, someone else handling our technology, the data and everything, software data, infrastructure, it's all out there in the cloud, versus on-premise where we install it. We've got the servers here on site. So I think conceptually at a really high level, most of us understand that differentiation, but there's a lot more to it. And just chatting with you earlier this week to prepare for this discussion, you actually helped me better understand some of the nuances of all these little differences, or the little subsections of what the cloud really is. So maybe just help us unpack the cloud in general. What does it mean? What are the major components of it?
For sure. So I think I love the bumper sticker that says, we all got excited about the cloud, but it was just someone else's computer. And I always find that in the end just my favorite little quip when it comes to cloud conversation. But for me, the cloud is best understood to me using those old as a service definitions that we all went through when we were doing Management of Information Services 101 in college. And for me, I'm a Euclidean, so I think everything in life can be summarized by a straight line. So if you take kind of the dimensions of an application deployment, and on the one side you have your traditional on-premise deployment. You have a local server, you have a local installation, you have the data center, you have the cooling, the hardware, all of the infrastructure to make sure that this thing runs successfully, redundant power, physical security, etc. That's kind of on the one dimension of a computer deployment. On the far end, you have what we call software as a service. And software as a service is kind of your purest version of what we might call cloud. And that is where there is no install, that from a software owner standpoint, you as the recipient of the software have no visibility to the installation and the final product of how that software lives. You just consume the output. Now, between that, there are a lot of kind of variations that differ in varying ways. So as we go kind of from the on-premise towards pure SaaS, you run into what sometimes is called infrastructure as a service. And in this case, with infrastructure as a service, you have a cloud provider, a data center, or what have you, providing the tools to allow you to carve out virtualized servers inside of their data center. So they have a whole bunch of server stacks. They have that all built out. What they have on top of that is this software layer that allows you to virtualize and scope out, scale out the server architecture you need to do your install. So from an installation standpoint, you still have what we call a perpetual license of the software. You are still installing it on a box or a set of boxes that you have physical control of. You can define and control the properties of those servers, which is one of the big pieces of cloud, right? Elasticity and scalability. You say how much RAM you need, the number of cores, etc., on a given box. and you have kind of that full control, but you also have the responsibility of everything else other than that physical manifestation. As you move a little further out, we talk about platform as a service. And with platform as a service, it often happens where you have someone who's kind of playing the middleman. They're consuming those raw cloud resources from the data center, and they are scaling and scoping out that work for the end customer in terms of building out the environments, and then optionally installing and managing the software itself that goes on those environments. So from a customer standpoint, you have less responsibility to keep the overall ecosystem running. You still have access to that back end of the server to be able to see your data or see your application and manage some of that. But you also have kind of a partner working with you to assist you in that area. Now, Estes, that's kind of the area for us and where we have the most footprint and visibility. We work kind of between that level of infrastructure and platform as a service, kind of work with our customers to give different variants of that. It's when you get from platform as a service and now you go further down the dimensions, now you're talking about pure software as a service. So at this point, the customer no longer has visibility to that server foundation. They're just really consuming that software from a pure client standpoint. And it's really that kind of dimension is where when we talk about cloud, anytime you stop living on an on-premise server, you're working with some version of the cloud. And depending on kind of the needs of the business and how you best work with the tools at hand, you might choose one or more versions of that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting, and it's helpful to think of it in a continuum, like the way you just laid it out. And I think one of the big things that resonates with me as you're talking about this is the fact that there's still a lot of holdouts for the cloud. A lot of CIOs and IT directors that they like the control they have, they like the transparency, the visibility, the ownership, whatever you want to call it. They like just knowing they've got their own stack, they've got their technology, the data, it's all right there. They can, for better or for worse, they control it. And, I think a lot of companies are afraid to make that huge leap over to SaaS, on the other extreme where it's just not only in the cloud, but it's multi-tenant and you have less flexibility. You don't really see what's happening behind the scenes. But what you're saying is there's some hybrid, they're not really hybrid options, but there's things that aren't as extreme of a jump for some of those companies that do want to retain control and maybe have more flexibility. Is that true? Would you agree with that?
Yes.
More options?
Yeah, entirely. There are some gradients along the way that a company who doesn't want to commit completely to a SaaS option for one of a number of reasons, and there are reasons that are your classical change management reasons that are just difficult to handle the change. There are also, I think, in my mind, more legitimate reasons that keep a company from moving straight into a pure SaaS version. But to your point, there are different gradients between the infrastructure and platform as a service models that allow you to take away some of the capital investment costs, some of the risks, some of those challenges that come from a pure on-site, on-premise server, and start to consume the cloud in varying ways to help make your business better and make your bottom line better as well. So those are definitely some areas that, and when we had discussed earlier, the idea of an ERP system quite often is much more of a tangled web than when we talk about it academically. We say an ERP is this thing where in reality it is a core system with a number of bolt-ons, integrations, reporting tools, other things that are hooking into a given platform. And the challenge with a implementation and a cloud deployment is quite often you're not just moving the ERP system, you're moving the ERP system and repointing or moving all of the other components to that. So I think of a company's IT platform as like an octopus where you have 8 legs, and some of those legs are stuck back in an on-premise model. Some of those legs are already into the SaaS model. And as you migrate your ERP software, you want to make sure that you don't cut off any of those legs along the process. And with a IaaS or a platform as a service model, you have the ability to do some of that migration without it being as disruptive for the business.
Yeah, that's a good point. Great point. Do you find that, given the maturity level or lack thereof of some cloud ERP systems in the market or enterprise technologies in general, do you find that a majority of organizations are doing some sort of mix where it's some stuff in the cloud, but you're still trying to figure out how to tie it back to or integrate back to on-prem systems and tie it all together? Is that the more common scenario, or are you finding that more companies are actually putting everything, all their core systems in the cloud?
It probably depends on where a given company is with its business system and how tangled its existing web is. That's probably one factor. Probably the level of complexity within the business is another driving factor. If you are, let's say, a discrete manufacturer with a really well developed and well defined product and a relatively straight business model, you are a much more likely candidate to move straight into a SaaS solution. Where you can use those functionalities and take them on and do well with it. And I've seen a lot of companies who do that and they're successful. There's another kind of class of companies that have more complex product, more complex business models, bigger challenges coming from the dealer networks or the supplier networks, the subcontractor networks, and a need for functionality that tends to stray from out of the box capabilities more commonly. And that's the class of companies where I find the middle models of IaaS or PaaS being more valuable to them because it gives them that ability to maintain some of those competitive edges that they've developed over the years with their ERP system. Some of those things are not things that are easily ported over into a pure SaaS model. I listened to a CEO of a company once describe kind of their future vision for the world, and he described it as kind of a balance between configurability and customizability. And for those customers with the simple product, the simple business model, they were the most likely the ones that could live within a configurable system that had very well prescribed boundaries. And for those customers who did not live within that system, there was the more perpetual license on-premise version of that installation that would allow them that greater flexibility. And then the benefits of these middle cloud versions is that you have the on-premise capabilities of the system, but you also have the deployment of the cloud. So it's kind of taking the best of those two sides of the coin and trying to blend them that way.
Yeah. Yeah. So just to maybe summarize the whole enterprise technology cloud landscape, you have, tying it back to your description of what the cloud is and some of those different options you have in the cloud. So on the one extreme, you're talking with the software as a service, multi-tenant, everything sort of managed by the software vendor and a little less flexibility that goes along with that. So examples of products that fit that model would be like a NetSuite or a Workday, Salesforce, like some of those pure SaaS solutions, right? And then you might have like a, SAP, Oracle, Epicor, Sage, those sorts of products where maybe you buy an instance of the software, but you have someone else hosting it, either infrastructure as a service or platform as a service. Is that how you would, like, how would you, if I were to go buy software and I sort of that hybrid model where I'm actually buying my own licenses, I'm not doing a multi-tenant model like a NetSuite where you just, you're logging in, you're using the same, version or whatever as everyone else, and you can't really or you have limitations on what you can customize. So you back off of that, and then you go with like a Epicor, let's just say, or SAP, whatever it is, and you want to have someone else host it. Tell us, like, how does that work? What does that look like?
Right. So the deployment model is one of those kind of magical parameters within the idea of software selection that doesn't always get considered. And I think it's always something that really should be considered. Let me just drop into an anecdote here of a customer who had brought in the Estes Group to help them install and implement the system. And on kickoff day, the IT director says, "So where's our web client? How do we deploy this to the web so our users can get at the application?" And we kind of looked at each other and said, well, it's actually a fat client deployment. The application doesn't have a robust web client that can support this implementation. And he kind of stood up in awe of, oh, how did we not know this? And it was one of those assumptions that we take on when we look at software selection. We think so much about functionality. What are the key things that the system can do for me? Can it configure my product? Can it handle my supplier structure? Can it handle customer requests coming in? We don't always think of how is the system going to get deployed? Will we have the access we need to be able to report and fine tune and do whatever else we need? And how will the users be consuming that? So that's a big kind of chunk of that. Now within the broader ERP landscape, like you said, there are software providers like NetSuite, like Plex, Salesforce, what have you, where it's really what you see is what you get. And you have this cloud version, this SaaS version, and it's really your deployment is self-evident. It's all browser based. So those things are all made very clear for you. As you deviate out of those classes of applications, it gets a little more dicey because you have a lot of providers who are kind of in a middle ground between some form of a web client and some version of an on-premise client. I would say a couple off the cuff would be SysPro or Epicor would probably fall into that category where they have a SaaS version and they have a on-premise version, and they're running in a parallel model. So as a consumer, as a buyer, you need to be determining, between the two of those to say, yeah, am I going to look and go in this direction of the on-premise version, or is the SaaS version capable enough to meet my needs? So it's with that family of companies that are kind of that predated cloud, predated SaaS, that really have that conundrum of how to kind of bring their platforms forward without losing all that robust functionality that they built in the process.
Right. Okay, that makes total sense. One quick thing for the audience of those of you that are watching this live on Crowdcast, YouTube, LinkedIn, or Twitter, any of those platforms where we're live streaming today, I encourage you to drop in any questions you have along the way. If you have questions, anything to do with cloud, managed services, that sort of thing, feel free to chime in and list those questions in the chat box. I'm watching all the platforms here to make sure we're responsive to that. And also, if you wouldn't mind, just drop in the comment section as you're watching here, whatever platform you're watching, just drop in a comment section of where you're listening from today. I'd love to hear where the audience is from and kind of who our audience is here. So I'll keep going with some questions here, but as the audience has questions, we'll work those into the mix as well, Brad. So excellent. I guess just to maybe shift gears a little bit. So, this gets back to hosting providers. So, if I just back up and I think like a consumer, like a CIO or a potential organization that may potentially move to the cloud, it seems like the big names, it seems like if you're going to move to the cloud and you're talking to an ERP vendor that's not SaaS, let's just say it's like SAP or Oracle or Sage or Epicor or whoever it is, and you want to, you're looking for a cloud solution. A lot of times it seems like the market will tell you or suggest that your options are somewhat limited. You can either have the vendor provide the hosting services, or they might have a partner like Azure or Amazon Web Services that does all their hosting for them. Obviously, Estes Group, the company you work for, is in the same space. Tell us how you guys compare yourself, or kind of how a mid-tier option like an Estes that isn't necessarily an Amazon, how do you guys fit in the space, and kind of what's your value proposition as it relates to other hosting providers?
Oh, that makes good sense. And so there's the kind of pure from a infrastructure as a service standpoint. You have customers who are looking to consume Amazon or Azure and use that directly as their source for carving out resources and building out their own system. And that's kind of sometimes how it gets framed up to the customers. It's either you can work through the vendor and have the vendor host that for you, or you can work through a big data center and work there and do that work. Now, what the challenge for a lot of companies has to do with, I don't have the resources internally to manage that environment. And what doesn't always get understood is that there's a kind of a middle ground for that. And that's where the Estes Group has been kind of targeting our work. And that is where we're working as kind of a middleman between the cloud provider and the consumer to build out that environment for them, and kind of work in the place of the customer to build out an environment that meets their needs performance-wise, scalability-wise, and then work with the cloud provider to make sure that we're getting the best cost that we can pass along to the customer, but also getting all the necessary resources to keep that system running. Make sure that we're picking a provider that has the appropriate like ITAR certification or CMMC if there are like compliance issues, but also working with a provider that has really good no downtime and reliability, because data centers, in spite of their notoriety, are sometimes notorious for some of the outages, and those outages are pretty widespread and really hit a business. So making sure that we're working with a provider that has that reliability in terms of their company and their provisions of services is really important. So we step in, we take those resources, we install, we manage, and then we work with the customer to define Now, how much control do you, Mr. or Mrs. Customer, want of this application, this environment? And then we scale our pricing model and our relationship with them accordingly. And I think that's really, if you're a customer looking to go into the cloud, those are questions you should be asking yourself and your provider. How much control do I want? How many services or assistance do I want? And what am I exactly paying for? Because in the cloud, one of the best spaces, or one of the best aspects of this space, is that elastic computing, Moore's law. You've probably heard the term. Moore's law has become one of those drinking games. Everybody takes a shot whenever someone in a webinar like this mentions it. But the reality of Moore's law is that processing power is going up, and because of that, it's going up faster than the needs of the software. So costs should be coming down. And so you want to make sure that when you're working with a provider, that you're understanding, what does that cost model look like? We have some customers who have cyclical business needs, where come the busy season, let's say they're driving ready to get everything for September 1 because the kids got to be in school, and their computing needs will spike similarly. And then when they hit winter, those computing needs will drop. So where we work out with some customers, is there a cyclical business cycle that we can work out, that you can dial up our resources allocated to us during this period, and then dial them down and have the cost model run accordingly. So that's some of the flexibility you get in this kind of private cloud architecture that's, I think, really beneficial for customers.
Right. Yeah, that makes good sense. Now, what about when we're looking at the cloud in general? There's a few different aspects of it. I mean, there's the hosting itself, and I think that seems like the most fundamental thing. Is I'm looking for someone to host my software. And obviously, you've already talked about the infrastructure aspect of it, the platform piece of it. But let's dive into some other areas, or some of the other benefits of cloud. When you look at, or maybe not necessarily benefits. You'll probably tell us there's benefits, but I guess just more how it's addressed in the cloud. So when you look at something like data management, I mean, how does data? We look at the whole bucket of data and analytics, business intelligence, all that stuff. How does the cloud enable that, or how does it work differently in the cloud versus if I'm managing that stuff on premise?
So if you're managing it in the cloud, one big benefit then, of course, is access. You want to be able, as a customer, quite often, to access your data and consume it in whatever way you need. If you're in a pure SaaS environment, sometimes that gets to be challenging. You're either setting up some API to perform replication, or you're kind of working through the solutions of the SaaS provider to get access to data, which can be a little clunky at times. When you're in a pure model where you have direct access, your options become pretty significant in terms of what you can or can't do. What I've seen a lot of, this is where I think hybrid clouds and the discussion of different levels of integration become really commonplace, where you have third parties that might be needing to get access to your data. In a cloud environment, you have a nice amount of control to be able to define which ports you're going to open, what APIs you're going to allow, how you're going to allow other applications, either internally to your own subnet or outside to the outside world, to come in, extract data, and work back and forth. It's pretty common in this structure to have, I would say, a fair bit of localized reporting requirements, because I say those tend to be a little easier on customers from a overhead and cost standpoint. So it's very common to see replication through the business analytics tool like Microsoft, or the similar tools that are reporting against them, as well as even things as simple as Crystal reports or what have you. There's a fair bit of work that can be done across multiple platforms to be presenting data back to the end users.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense. And what about cybersecurity? A lot of organizations are, with all that's going on in the world right now with cybersecurity breaches and whatnot. There's two schools of thought. It seems like you've got some that would argue that cloud's going to be more secure because you have professionals that are going to have minimum criteria, security criteria, best in class security controls and whatnot. Then you have another school of thought that says, well, I want control. Back to the control issue. I want control. I want to know what's happening with my data and the security and all that stuff. How does cybersecurity factor into cloud, and how does cloud enable better cybersecurity?
And it's a really good question, and I think one that people should be asking when they're kicking the tires. If I'm putting this in a cloud, am I painting a target on myself? I know customers come to us asking that question. Am I making myself more vulnerable or less? And there are certainly a number of factors here. Let me give you another anecdote. I seem to speak better when I'm talking about a specific example, but the idea of cybersecurity as it relates to ERP, quite often we think of those as very separate things. I had a customer that was going live on an ERP system, and the entire business, it was on premise. They had their own IT staff, they had their own application management staff, and the whole business was focused on cutover weekend, getting ready to go live on this ERP system. And it just so happens that some hackers were targeting that same time period, because over cutover weekend they got themselves hacked and ransomed. So the entire environment, the entire ecosystem, their ERP system, and pretty much everything else went down all at once. And they literally went dark on us. We were to the point where we were speaking to their IT director over his Gmail account, and he was communicating us to over his phone because it was the only device in the building that hadn't been compromised. And sometimes I think of security. There's one benefit that I like about the apportionment of servers into the cloud is that you get kind of a segregation of duties effect that comes from saying this computer is only going to be used for these purposes. And I know, coming from a customer environment where we had a big data center and a lot of blades, you tend to multi-purpose things, and it gets easier and easier to treat a server to serve multiple functions. And you say, okay, well, can I have this? Can I put a file server on here so that it can connect to my CNC machines? And suddenly you've opened up what often is a big vulnerability when you start connecting stuff to shop floor devices, because there's some risk to be had there. So that segregation of duties is one way I think where security gets to be really helpful in the cloud, because we tend to apportion servers to do very specific functions and not to extend beyond those. The other piece I like about the cloud when it comes to security is the fact that you're kind of oh, how do we say it? Was it New said he was sitting on the shoulders of giants? When you're working with a data provider, a data center provider, you're working on the platform that they've developed, and they themselves have bomb shelter level facilities that they've done, that built up to secure, that have redundant power, that have extra cooling, all the things needed to keep a system safe and protected, and have all their own security stack layered on top of that at a software level, so that at a software application level you have an initial layer of security that you're building on top of. Now, as a managed service provider, you have the ability to layer on top of that kind of a best-in-class security suite of endpoint security management and local and web-based management to try and connect, monitor your servers, monitor your behavior of your servers internally, so that you can watch that, and also keep everything segregated, so that you can, if you ever run into a situation where something looks strange on one device, you can isolate, you can fence in that device very quickly and go in and look at it without affecting the rest of the ecosystem. So I think there's some benefits there, like economies of scales that come from being able to take a best-in-class security solution and lay it over your entire ecosystem of customers.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes total sense. And yeah, one thing I'll advise clients on, or our team will advise clients on, is that, if you're worried about having a bullseye on you because you've got your data and systems in the cloud, one way to think about that risk is, who's more likely to have, more seasoned and tighter controls, or security protocols that are going to protect the data. I mean, a cloud provider like Estes, you guys have a lot to lose if you have a breach. You have a lot, that's your whole business. And, your job, that's really your only job. That's what you specialize in, is providing these cloud platforms and environments and secure cloud environments. Whereas, the average IT shop for an internal organization just isn't going to have that level of sophistication and, best in class security tools and whatnot. So I always use that as a sort of a counterpoint to people that say, well, I don't want to be exposed because someone else has my data or someone else has my systems in the cloud. So I think it's a good point.
It really is.
What about,
we work with a customer. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, I just say I'm really a believer in no single solution applies to everyone. And we come into some cases where we see a customer and they have a really best in class IT structure. They've followed one of those best in class compliance models of this is how we're going to structure our support so that we have help desk people worrying about help desk issues and we have network admins and architects worrying about the architecture. And you're able to build out a sufficient structure to manage that full time. We're not going out there to try and say, oh, yeah, you need to gut that system and move it if you have a successful staff and a successful business process internally. If you're one of those folks who has the network admin who is always driving in four directions, fixing an end user terminal on one day, putting together terminal services on the next, and supposed to check security messages in the evening, you have one of those cases where you might be wanting to look to apportion some of those duties to the cloud. Because I think that's an area where you can better focus your people internally and give them a few fewer responsibilities to try and burden while you kind of take this and you portion that out into a cloud environment.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes total sense. What about the speed of cloud versus on-premise? I know I was actually chatting with a client this morning, a new client that's moving off of some old AS400 applications, and they were talking about how one of the challenges or the hard parts of moving off an AS400 environment is that it's so reliable and the performance is so great, and they're worried about then going to a cloud environment where maybe it's not quite as stable or not quite as reliable. But how would you compare? So there's a mindset amongst a certain subset of the market that
Sure.
cloud can't be as reliable, can't be as fast, or whatever. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, just how does cloud affect speed and performance overall for your applications and your systems?
Well, I see kind of both. I see both sides of the spectrum often with my customers. I see customers, and this is even at an ERP level before you've even discussed cloud. The movement of from a black screen plain old C based application where you enter a couple of fields into a green screen, you hit enter, and boom, 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 all this stuff happens. Moving from that to a multi-tiered client server architecture like an Epicor or like a Sage, the expectation management is necessary there, just from an application standpoint. The idea is the goal of these systems is to reduce time across the value stream and not necessarily make each individual's life more efficient. So that's a check that we try to have in terms of the expectation management. It says, yes, Mr. Purchasing Agent, when you hit the button, you may have an extra quarter second of latency, but that time is spent in providing greater value to the rest of the value stream. So that's one piece that you kind of layer out there because it can be very easy to conflate the challenges of application migration and the architecture migration. Now, when we work with a customer to determine how they want to deploy their applications, the ability to have secure and robust access to the outside world in terms of your internet access is certainly an important consideration. And we run into situations where we'll be working with a factory that is next to a railroad track. And because of such, they don't have a good pipe coming in. They only have, they might be beaming off their cousin's network or something, doing something goofy to try to get internet inside of the building. And the legitimate infrastructure of the local community prevents them from having that robust connection that would say, we're going to steer you down the road to a low on-premise install because really this is going to be the best choice for you. Now, as technology options increase, some of that changes a little bit. I have StarNet or Starlink on my own home because I live out in the sticks. And as that continues to improve, I'm seeing personally some of the benefits that you can see. So that there are different options out there as time progresses. But we were working with another customer just recently and doing some ping tests to see how quickly they could get out to our data center versus get into their own network. And we were finding that the data center pings were actually coming back quicker because the connections were well defined and kind of best of breed. Because once you got into their outside network, the architecture was at such a better level that the ability to move things through all the switches and gears was much faster than they had internally. So yeah, you could bring that local infrastructure up to speed, but that's where your capital investment becomes a concern. And is that really where you want to be going? So I think speed is always a concern and a consideration, but I've seen in a lot of cases our customers are happy with the speed that they get because you have the economies of scale that come from these data centers.
Yeah, that's interesting. I never thought of it in the way you just framed it, as far as just getting out of the myopic view of speed. How fast is it? Oh, it's not fast enough, then therefore it's not a good fit. It's easy to fall into that sort of myopic assessment of cloud. But if you look at it from the overall value chain perspective, and as long as the performance and speed is, a minimum level of acceptable speed, then,
Right.
it doesn't matter if that doesn't really matter if that quarter second, delay from the time you hit enter until it, the transaction is completed. I think that's a good point. Now, I do, just as a counterpoint to that, I actually was talking to a lot of the work we do at Third Stage is expert witness type of work, and we were actually talking to an attorney client of ours for an expert witness case, and one of the facts of the case is it involves a SaaS software provider that had provided and implemented their solution, and one of the things that they had found is that it wasn't a split second; it was more like a 6 to 8 second delay, from from the time a transaction was completed, and that was, multiply that times however many hundreds or thousands of transactions that this particular company has, and that was, creating a big slowdown in their operation. So, do you see that with, is there, are you more likely to have that kind of a performance issue with like a SaaS provider, multi-tenant, because it's, the servers get jammed with all the transactions they're doing, or is there any difference, or is it just a matter of having a better infrastructure provider that can, provide better performance?
That's a really good question, and I wouldn't want to answer for the SaaS people in terms of how they're doing their architecture. I don't think that would be fair of me, but I do always, it's a challenge in multi-tenant environments, and we offer versions of multi-tenancy, and the challenge of multi-tenancy always has to do beyond security, right? If you have security needs where ITAR mandates that you lock things down, you don't share resources, that's one thing, but beyond that, a multi-tenancy environment, even if you're doing something where you're sharing the SQL Server box, let's say, between applications, that can draw less investment on your point, but you do understand that you are sharing resources across a collection of individuals. And if you're truly looking for a certain dedicated performance, you do need to figure out how much that's worth it to you and whether or not you want to apportion that accordingly. Because I think there's definitely a challenge for scaling your resources appropriately to meet your load and to make sure that you have visibility to whether or not that's being scaled properly. For us, that's kind of one of the benefits we like to work with our customers, is that they have visibility to that. We give people line of sight to understand, this is where the CPUs are pegging, or this is how much RAM you're consuming, or this is how much data is coming into the SQL server, to say, okay, we think that you've hit a level here now, your transaction loads justifies additional increases in resources. And that's where the cloud benefits show themselves, is that you can dial those things up when you need them to. But I think really the conversation between customer and provider needs to be open, so that as they feel that pain, you're giving them good answers to the questions. Because the idea of the cloud is just a black box from which no other information comes out is a real scary conundrum for a customer.
Yeah. That's a great point. What about when you look at the transition to the cloud? So say I'm an organization, I'm the CEO or CIO of an organization, and I've got a pretty well entrenched, well established, mature IT team. I've got an IT infrastructure. I'm used, for better or for worse, I'm used to having all my, my infrastructure housed in my four walls. What does that transition look like? I mean, how, just from more from a organizational perspective, but also from a technical perspective, how difficult is that for companies to give that up and to make the jump, and to, it's probably not as easy as it sounds.
Sure.
How do you see the client?
I would say the idea there is you talk a lot about change management. I really think a lot of it has to do with change management. One of the kind of pillars of change management is open communication of what the current versus the future state looks like, to say, okay, currently we're doing this and we're seeing things this way and we're processing things in this way. In the future, these are the differences, and make those differences real apparent for people. Because I think when change happens, quite often the biggest shock is not that the change happened, but that I wasn't aware, that I did not plan for that change to happen, that I didn't realize that on Monday I would be accessing the system in a different way than I was on Friday. So one of the biggest pieces of what we do is rolling out that change to understand these are the implications. Now, the easiest way to do this is through test environments. And as part of a migration to a system, we first spin up the environment. We get a ecosystem put together where we can connect them to the application server through, let's assume it's a terminal services farm that they're coming into, and they're going to access through a terminal services farm. They get used to that idea, and they're like, well, in the old days, I had a local client install, and I connected there, and I had the look and feel of a client install. Well, now if we're going to be in a terminal services farm, this is what it's going to look like. Instead, these are the differences you're going to see when you need to get a downloaded file. You go here instead of there. And because of these things, we can offer these benefits. Because that's using the terminal services example, fat client architectures tend to be pretty fat in terms of the amount of data, the amount of chattiness they have when they're talking to the application server. So you have client to the app server tends to be pretty chatty with a lot of applications. You move that to a terminal services farm that's inside of the network. Now you're just speaking to this essentially dumb terminal, and all the heavy lifting is happening in very short distances inside, so that your final performance might be something that's better than your current state. And trying to help people understand these are the implications, these are the benefits, this is why we're doing it, is really an important piece of that whole testing cycle as you verify that all the pieces of this cloud architecture are going to work for you in the future.
Yeah. Great point. And one of the things that you had mentioned the other day when you and I spoke about this stuff, getting ready for this discussion, you had talked about, I think you were talking about manufacturing and distribution companies in particular, but you were talking about how different industries have different business processes and different workflows required within their applications and their data flows and things like that. And one thing that I didn't know and I didn't fully understand until you sort of explained it to me was that, that the type of industry you're in and the understanding of the industry is very important when establishing a cloud infrastructure, because it's not as simple as just put it in the black box, to use your words, just throw it out there in the cloud, and how hard can it be? So tell us how the industry nuances, whether you're a manufacturer, distributor, or whatever example you want to give, how does that affect how you set up your cloud environments?
Yeah, it does have a big effect on the overall service model that we work to provide for ourselves, is because we're coming from a kind of a functional into a technical realm. As we ramped up our technical folks and brought in more people to handle the speeds and feeds, we kept them tightly integrated with our consultant and application management level of people, so that we could bring in those two pieces to help manage the application. Because in my mind, platform as a service definitely has a component of application management that bleeds into technical management. And so understanding in an MRP environment or a manufacturing environment, I have nightly processes that are running inside of the system. Those processes have a technical component in terms of the lag they have on the server and the database, and also an end user component in terms of this is what I want to see coming out the backside. As a consultancy that does hosting, we try to keep that blended to understand these are the potential areas, the pain points that you're going to see when you install a server. And that's where we've had folks come to us kind of from the mom and pop MSP world, where they knew someone, cousin Ned could throw my application up in an ERP, but once it was up there, he didn't know what to do with it. So we couldn't figure out how to get SSRS running in a way that was helpful to manage our business. Or we were an engineering firm, and you take a lot of manufacturing in America is very configurable and thus very engineering intensive in terms of the drawings, the CAD, the other things that come along to that stuff that needs to be shown up and down the value stream. You might be sending this to a customer at the point of quoting, or you might be showing it to the folks on the shop floor as they manufacture the actual components. And those have implications on what kind of server network you have in terms of a file share system, and making sure that you're confirming that you can pass those files through that system efficiently. The inability to do those kinds of industry-specific things can create big gaps. And if you're working on the kind of the integration platform, a lot of, as we had talked, a lot of companies are, integrated across a number of little apps and big apps. The ability to help a customer figure out how they're going to take this custom quality management app that they developed in-house back in 94 and make sure that it can still speak to their ERP data, because they don't have a way of doing anything with that app right now. That's kind of a critical piece of that. So it comes with understanding the core needs of the organization, but also those kind of funny exceptions that after you've done enough of these are no longer exceptions, because they kind of relate to those industries.
Yeah. So if you're an organization that, has a fairly complex MRP process, the material resource planning within a manufacturer, or if you're a high volume e-commerce, B2C retailer that's providing sales online. I mean, those are like different nuances I would suspect that would affect your cloud platform or your cloud setup differently. Is that true? Like you wouldn't just, those wouldn't be two scenarios where you just throw them both in the cloud and you're good. There's nuances to that that you'd have to adjust the cloud to that.
For sure. If you're talking with a situation, let's use the MRP as an example, and this varies depending on the application that you've installed. But many applications allow you to stick processes over on their own server. You call it your process server. So you can split out your server architecture. So you have your primary application server, you have a secondary process server where these processes, these large processes that take up a lot of bandwidth and load, can run independently of the rest of the environment. They're speaking to the database. They're orchestrated from the application server, and that allows now that MRP might be a bear, but it is not loading on the same box that the end users are connecting. So the end users can connect and do their business without running into these performance degradations that a MRP load might be taking. Same thing, say with a e-commerce, you can split out in many environments multiple application threads so that you have multiple threads. You have a set of user threads, so they're connecting to an application server, whereas your e-commerce platform that might be very transactionally intensive, loading a lot of sales orders, let's say, also is connecting to a separate application server. Those in conjunction are speaking to the same database. So you have the same single point of authority in that database, but the application layers that can speak to it, you can branch those out and kind of segregate them so they're not conflicting with each other from a performance standpoint.
That's really well put. I mean, one thing I love about this conversation is, first of all, when we're talking about cloud, I'm over my head. Like I'm way out over my head right here talking about all this cloud stuff because that's not my strength, and cloud infrastructure and architecture and all that stuff is not one of my biggest strengths. So you're conveying this in a really helpful way, but you're also unpacking a lot of these little nuances of cloud that I wasn't fully aware of or didn't fully understand until having this conversation. So that's interesting. So it's part industry. So you've got different processes, workflows, and needs that would affect how you set up cloud, and then certainly the applications too. Like when you guys do different you provide cloud solutions for multiple software solutions. So
correct.
If you're setting up Sage versus Epicor, for example, those are two different configurations, if you will, of cloud. Is that correct, or is it?
It is.
Is your cloud
really
architecture affected by?
Totally. We have, I think, probably the biggest difference that I see between applications right now is you'll have a very standard separate SQL Server box that the application speaks to. The presence of an application server in especially in older architectures that are just starting to migrate to cloud deployments, we run into applications that have extreme fat clients that they're not even speaking through an application server. They're actually speaking directly to the database. Such a client takes up a huge footprint on a machine, so you find yourself having to spin out terminal server farms to account for that. Now the challenge there is even on a terminal server, they can take a lot of resources, so you need to really build out those terminal servers with a lot of sockets and CPUs to handle these applications, because these fat clients tend to consume one CPU per application. So you find yourself creating really robust server farms to allow 15 or 20 users to get into that terminal server. And then as you hit kind of your natural limit, now you find yourself spinning up and you create that set of terminal servers and you integrate them as a farm so that they can speak back to the database. If that is one architecture footprint. Now, if you get to a client server application that has a web interface, that its client is purely web-based, now you may not have a terminal services layer at all. So you might have the end users and the end user terminal are communicating directly with the application server across the wires, and there's no need for a significant client deployment. And so those are some of the basic challenges. We've even have customers that have kind of parallel processes as some ERPs are migrating themselves and building application server layers that allow for e-commerce to support, because And really, the idea of applications speaking directly to the databases is something that's, I would have thought it would have already gone out of style, but it's still around with us. But as we slowly get there, I see customer or vendors creating application server layers initially for things like e-commerce to speak to those and provide an API layer so that you can provide business logic, but also to begin to migrate their client base so that the client computers are now speaking through the middleware and not through the database itself, and thinning out the client layer as a result.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. So you need to, when you're assessing potential managed service providers, you need to know that they understand your industry, they understand the technology you're deploying, because those all have implications on how you set up. It's not a one size fits all, just set up a
Right.
platform for them and go at it.
It certainly
Yeah.
isn't, and this activity should be done in conjunction with functional experts of the application and its management, along with technical experts. And that's been for us as we branch out into other systems, because we get to the point where another system becomes available, another opportunity. Then we find ourselves partnering with kind of a broader community to say, okay, now that we want to take on a different system, what is the right knowledge level that needs to be had to do this successfully? Because we don't want to just be the mom and pop shop that takes someone's application and throws it up in the cloud and says you're done. We want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that is maximizing the customer value, because the idea of the cloud is that the customer is getting value out of it. And if you're not taking care to take care of those nuances, I think you're ultimately doing them a disservice.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And it gets back to the point too of, of really closely and carefully evaluating your managed service providers, because again, it's not just, I think the first two that come to mind for a lot of people is AWS and Azure or Azure.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the two big ones, but there's a lot of other options and there's a lot of other considerations. It's not just, is it a name I recognize? Is it, you want to know that there's some targeted expertise that you need for your specific deployment.
For sure, for sure. What is what capabilities? What tier are you talking about? What level of redundancy do they offer? Every server or data center tier level comes with different expectations and requirements and service levels, and understanding what your service level expectations are relative to the provider that you have is really important, as well as knowing what their expertise level and how much expertise they can provide to help you get to where you need to be. Because if there's a gap between, say, what AWS is willing to do and where you need to go, if there's a space in there, or if there's some point in that chain between AWS and your end user, you want to make sure that you have all of those points covered along the way. Else you get a gap in the application layer or a gap at the technical services layer, you might find yourself in a bit of trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense. So I guess just to summarize, so if we back up here a second, come back up to the big picture, and we want to summarize, kind of wrap up the conversation, to summarize some of the big themes of what are the big takeaways for cloud deployments. I think one is the one we just covered, which is, make sure you carefully consider your managed service provider, and that you understand you make sure that they understand your industry, your workflow, your functional needs, as well as your applications and data structure and all that technical stuff. There's also, just the understanding of what type of cloud solution are you looking for? Is it multi-tenant SaaS? Is it more of a platform as a service, infrastructure as a service? That's another nuance. What other big takeaways or big sort of closing words of advice would you give to someone who's really trying to understand the cloud better, or thinking about making that leap into the cloud? What kind of big picture takeaways would you leave us with?
Well, I think the first would be, and we've touched on this a bit, is the idea of knowledge and knowing what your options are. Because I think too often when you go into a car lot and the salesperson gives you two options between what's available, you might come to believe that I can either have a pickup truck or a minivan, and you realize that I don't like either of them on the highway. You find yourself when you're off on the road now, maybe I needed to figure out what my options really were. So really a lot of it starts with understanding what my options are, and then when you start evaluating those options, how do those map against your expectations? I think expectation management is a really important thing in terms of, if you are a company that has if you're coming from a highly customized, highly tailored software environment, and I want to jump into ERP, There's a big leap right there that you're making culturally from a system, from an out of the box system to going from to an out of the box system from a highly customized, tailorable system. That leap is huge in itself. Understanding that, am I picking a software version that is it a huge jump, or is it something that's sort of falling in between that I can make that migration kind of partway there to a nice middle road? Because if you take a direction that's kind of the extreme, you might find kind of shock across the company of how you make that change. So understanding what those options really have in terms of their impact on the organization, I think really is the thing you have to live with after you've signed the check.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. And then last question I'll ask you: what big trends do you see? What's the big trend or two you see happening in the cloud space in the next 3 or 5 years?
I think the deployment of services to browser-based clients is a really big deal. That has been something that I think has been in the works for a long time, and I've seen a lot of vendors start to get over the hump with these and be able to put out fully browser-based versions of their application that have a much better comparable offering in terms of what they offer. But not only that, a lot of legacy applications of just the last generation were all, we might say, WinForm based in terms of their construction, using at the application layer, and using more web-based protocols, more JavaScript-based protocols allows for a lot of different kind of paradigmatic shifts in terms of how data is presented to the user. So it's not just a matter of I'm moving into a browser. It's the movement into the browser allows now for a whole different paradigm of I can get this kind of data rolled up and presented in a much more real-time way. I can more dynamically configure how my work experience is going to be. The WinForm had tended to be a very kind of structured, here's what you have to work with it. Whereas web designs, more often they build these with the assumption that I'm going to have some sort of grid or tile view that I'm going to allow you to come and plug and play what matters to you, so that when you're entering data at this point, you're looking at some indicators here that are telling you how well your factory is doing, how well your work area is doing, if exceptions are jumping up that you need to manage. And that's, the ability to be refreshing those things and keeping those in real time. That whole architecture allows, I think, for a lot of really neat tools to be deployed to the users. And they're not just neat tools. I think they have some true value to them.
Really interesting. Yeah. The web browser piece is a fascinating one too. It seems like that's where it makes sense that that's where we'd be headed right now. So that's really good
Right.
stuff. So, real quick as we wrap up, how do people get a hold of you? What's your website address? Maybe repeat your name just so they can find you on LinkedIn.
Yeah, Brad Feakes, Feakes. I'm on LinkedIn. My company is Estes Group, and our website is estesgrp.com.
Great. Well, perfect. Well, I've enjoyed working with you guys over the years. Your owner, Bruce Grant, is someone I've known for a long time, and appreciate having you on the show. It's been good to get to know you, and I've learned a ton on this discussion. So I really appreciate having you here
Excellent.
today. So thanks for being here, Brad.
You bet, Eric. Thank you so much.
You bet. And thanks to the audience for listening. Thanks for being here. I hope you guys got value out of this as well. Just as a reminder, every Friday afternoon at 2 p.m. Eastern Time in the United States is when we typically do these live streams. You can also see it again either on my YouTube channel, LinkedIn, or we actually include these interviews in our weekly podcast that comes out on every Wednesday. So every Wednesday, Transformation Ground Control is the name of the podcast. You can find it on YouTube. You can also find it on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, all that good stuff. So look for Transformation Ground Control. You'll see this interview actually show up in a soon to be released episode of Transformation Ground Control, and hope to see you all next Friday. Thanks for being here. Have a great day, everyone.